Characterize people by their actions, and you will never be fooled by their words. Ladies, quick show of hands. How many of you out there have had this experience with a guy? You meet him, seems wonderful, he says all the right things, but after a month, maybe two of dating, or you're in a relationship, you start to observe things that make you believe that perhaps he's not the guy he said he was. Men out there, have you had this exact same experience? You meet her and gosh, she just seems perfect. And things are going wonderful, but then you see something. And you don't say anything, and then you see it again. Maybe a few weeks down the road, and you start to realize that same thing. What's the overall idea? Actions speak louder than words. They always do. Now, it doesn't matter whether the words are spoken or whether the words are written down on parchment and a few hundred years old. In today's video, I'm going to show you guys something that I don't think you saw. Some people said, Florida Mucky, you seem conservative in some of your videos, and you've mentioned that you're armed and that you have arms, but you've also said in other videos that you don't believe that we have Second Amendment rights. Let me be very clear. I think it's a really, really good idea to be armed. I think it's an excellent idea to be armed, but I'm not deluded. I don't believe for 1 minute that our founding fathers had any interest in the unwashed masses being armed. And I've got a mountain of proof to show it. All this was providing for defense of the colonies. Now, that doesn't mean I'm against gun ownership. I'm very much for it. But if you believe that somehow on a piece of paper somewhere you have some right to it, I've got proof to the exact opposite. Stick around, you're going to want to see today's video. But real quick, she's back. Patriot Nurse has been very ill for quite some time. She mentioned 4 separate illnesses since last June. Well, it's been quite a while, but she put up a premiere video a little bit earlier today, The Fight Against Tyranny, Faith, Action, Miracles, the beginning of Hanukkah. So go check this out. Glad to see she's doing better. She looks like she's feeling better. She's got a lot of information about the coming schedule and what she's going to be doing in the new year. So welcome back, Patriot Nurse. Glad to see that things are going well for you. And as always, I want to be diligent every single day. Whether you agree with me, whether you disagree with me or otherwise, thank you. Thank you humbly for being here, for engaging in the conversation, for being polite, expressing your opinion. I very much value it. For those of you who have joined us over at the Patreon channel, it's only $1 per month, even less if you sign up for an entire year. Fully refundable. No questions asked first 90 days. You sign up and you have that $1 charge beginning of every month for what would be, now and January and February. And then you decide, it's not for me. All that money comes right back at you first 90 days. No questions. We can partner with Vimeo over there and show some things that are perhaps a little bit more than PG would allow here on YouTube. And we can also talk about things we're not allowed to talk about here. So once again, Patreon, thank you very, very much. Real quick for reference, today is Sunday, 18 December 2022, currently to 16:39 hours. That is 4:39 p.m. in the afternoon for those of you in the civilian world. It is currently 57 degrees. We had a high today of 65, a low tonight of 49 degrees. Winds are south-southwest. 1 mile an hour, no rain, barometer 30.15 inches of mercury. Now, many people have believed that over the last 10, 20, 30 years that those people in Washington, D.C. have decided that they don't want to honor the Constitution anymore, and they're trying to restrict this, right, and take this thing away and create these situations where they're violating what the Founding Fathers had originally intended. That's absolutely not true. I know, it's like, well, Florida Maquis, are you blind? Why don't we go back and look at just some basic facts of history? Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights by God, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Endowed by their Creator, and these rights are then enshrined in the Constitution. Now, many people say, okay, we're on the same sheet of music here, Mucky. You're speaking my language. Okay, now, Let's think about something. That was 1789. The ratification of the Constitution, the document that glued the 13 colonies together, 1789. Let's fast forward only 40 years to 1830, Andrew Jackson. And we covered this in another video. He was upset because the U.S. had issued weapons to the militia. The militia members in their homes had either lost the guns, they had fallen into disrepair, or they had sold them. Pardon me, this wasn't even 40 years later. This was only 29 years later in this particular case. You see, what did he want the militia standing up to do? Well, what he wanted the militia to stand up to do was to put down the Creek Indians that were rising up against the government. Now, think about this for just a minute. I want you to think about this for just a minute. From the perspective of a Native American male. Ladies, we'll get to you in just a second. You have one group of white guys with a leader named George, and they're wearing red jackets. And then you have this other group of white guys, and they're led by a guy named George, and they're wearing blue. And they're talking about freedom and liberty and weapons in the hands of the people to rise up against a tyrannical government. Wait a minute. What do you think the Creek Indians were doing? Do you think Andrew Jackson believed the Constitution gave rights to the Indians to take up arms against the Continental Congress, against the U.S.? Do you believe Andrew Jackson thought that the Indians, the Native Americans, had the ability to constitutionally rise up against tyranny? No, absolutely. Of course, that would be ridiculous, because he was mustering the militia to put them down. Andrew Jackson, founding father, was mustering the militia to put down men taking up arms against, at what would be that time, the federal government. They were native to the land, were they not? Were they not men endowed with inalienable rights? Were they not men? Let's go back. What does it say? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator, all men being created, with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Now, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Andrew Jackson was elected president in 1828. Andrew Jackson supported George's interest in removing the Cherokee from their land. This was the beginning of the Trail of Tears, by the way. The Indian Removal Act was enacted to remove all Indians from Georgia and settle them on land west of the Mississippi. Andrew Jackson, on behalf of the federal government, a founding father, was mustering militia, arming them to put down other men living within territory, living in America, who were rising up for their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Do you think Andrew Jackson gave one rat's ass about the life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness of the Native Americans? Do you think Andrew Jackson gave one rat's ass about the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of the Africans that were being shipped in here by the thousands and thousands and thousands that he owned? No. So you can write down on a piece of paper and say, well, we believe that, men should have weapons for this, that, and the other. The Native American said, okay, well, you're being pretty damn tyrannical. You're throwing us off our land. Literally, we've been here for thousands of years. You just showed up. And they saw no difference between George Washington and King George. The colors of these jackets versus the colors of these jackets. It was all white trespassers, who then used the force of the military to run people and to run these men into camps. You talk about, the government's going to put us in FEMA camps. Well, maybe so. Maybe so, because they don't believe you have this right. And they never did. And ladies, I promised we would get to you. At that time, this is a screenshot from the video from Gunpowder and Lead, the Miranda Lambert song. There is no way. There is absolutely no way in the world at that time, if your husband had put hands on you, that you would have been able to cry constitutional right to have a weapon to defend yourself. In fact, if you had even considered it, you would have likely been ended. It didn't exist at this time. You didn't have the right to vote. You were property. Women were property. In fact, at this time, and we're going to cover something a little bit later in the video that I'm sure a lot of you are going to remember, and you're going to think, oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that, because I know the age of most of my audience. You see, at this time, when the Founding Fathers were doing their thing in the 1700s, if you didn't occasionally put hands on your wife and correct her using corporal punishment, you were seen as being dilatory. You were seen as being soft. You were seen as being a pushover. You had to do that to make sure she respected and feared you. In fact, they had 3 Bible scriptures that they used to back that up. The idea that you could pick up a weapon and use it against your husband was laughable. It was ludicrous. If he had paid good money for you from your father, you might have been able to go to your father or brothers and make some petition to them to speak with him. But even then, they would have said, well, don't be such a smart mouth. Do a better job, is likely what they would have said. Now, here's the glue. It was many years later, 1870s, where they had to write the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, all of them, to make anything that was said in the original Constitution make sense. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That's right. And then they followed up, guess what? All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, whether they want to be or not. No state shall make any or force any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of, now they're starting to talk about citizens of the United States and not just men. See, this is where the conversation changes. They go from saying all men are created equal. Now they're talking here in the 14th Amendment in the late 1870, I believe. Citizens, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And then 15 is the right to vote not denied by race, but none of this applied to women. None of this applied to women, and none of it applied to Jews either, by the way. Seriously. This was the reality of the time. So if you are a person of color, if you are a Native American, if you are non-Christian, if you're a woman, okay, Constitution up until this point did not apply to you. The Constitution up until this point did not apply to you. These men did not believe it one bit, because they were running Native Americans off their land. They were going to another continent, grabbing up a whole bunch of men and women there, throwing them in chains, bringing them here, and having them work the land against their will. And women of any stripe were all property. This is the reality. How could you possibly say out of one side of your mouth that all men are created equal, they're all endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? How could you say that out of one side of your mouth while literally depriving all of those rights away from anyone of color, anyone who wasn't a Christian, anyone who was native to North America, and anyone who possessed two X chromosomes. Think about that for 1 minute. You see, I'm not against guns. I just don't believe these men for 1 minute were this enlightened. You would have to be a moron to believe that these men were this enlightened. It's ridiculous. 13, 14, 15. Now, I've used this image before talking about what's coming. Why is it important to not be deluded in this idea, this ridiculous idea that the founding fathers or the Constitution gives you rights? Because when things start to fall apart, none of that's going to matter. No piece of paper written 300 years ago is going to matter when things get ugly and things start to fall apart. Who remembers the analogy that I used? It was a scenario that I put forth that you had a survival group and you had all your stuff set up, and you noticed that, gosh, it seems like we're going through supplies faster than we should. And we've also had some of the women in our group say that they swear there's somebody outside looking in at night. And so you send out a scouting party, and lo and behold, you come across a group of minors, boys, that have a good chunk of your supplies, and they're making life for themselves, and they're the ones that have been doing all this. And I said, well, in this scenario, what would you do? Since they're minors, you would, of course, want to kind of take them under your wing. But what if, since the ladies would be primarily taking care of minors, they would say, look, there has to be an answer for this. What would you do? We want to make sure that there is respect given, and this is how we're going to ensure it, even though they're not our blood, so to speak. If they're going to be taken care of here, they're going to learn, and they're going to learn the hard way, initially right up front. What if I told you that, remember what I said about ladies way back then, that if men weren't occasionally corporally punishing their wives? As late as the 1960s and 70s, in the Midwest and in the South, there were certain churches that believed no matter how well behaved your kids were, they were just getting away with it. If you weren't catching them on a regular basis doing this wrong, doing that wrong, and if a month or 2 months or 3 months gone by and you hadn't taken a bell to them, you were doing them a disservice. So no matter what, I knew kids that once a month, no matter if they had been perfect, their parents assumed, based on scripture, that they just hadn't caught them doing the evil that they did, and they would get whipped once a month, no matter what. And they used 3 scriptures in the Bible to back it up. And I know this to be a fact. Now, my parents didn't believe that, but I had friends whose parents did. And I witnessed it, and it was brutal. Now, that was 1960s, 1970s. Only 50 years later, if you did that here in North America, even conservatives would say, yeah, you're a felon. If you're just beating your kids because you think they did something bad, or because they're just boys naturally just have evil thoughts and you should beat them whether you've caught them or not, yeah, you'd be a felon. You'd be a felon, you'd go to jail, you'd lose your kids. Now, that's the difference just between 1960s and 70s and 2022. What do you think the difference was way back here with these guys? You really think these guys were that enlightened? You see, they wanted to make sure they had arms against King George, for sure. But their idea that somehow the unwashed masses of people, that black people, Native Americans, women, Jews, that they all had rights to a gun and rights to rise up, to use those guns, to rise up, you're out of your mind. You're absolutely, completely out of your mind if you think that's the case. Andrew Jackson, I'll give you this article. Read it. He was incensed. He was incensed. Where, here it is. About the arms that had been distributed from the War of 1812 had disappeared. In fact, he says the greater portion of firearms have been sacrificed for a mere pittance and carried from the state, possibly now in the hands of those very savages who have been excited to war against us. So he was upset. He was absolutely angry beyond words that there were men in North America taking up arms against the federal government in defense of their own lands. You see, what does that tell you? You see, Andrew Jackson didn't see these men as men. That's why he referred to them as savages. He didn't see the men of Africa as men. Nor did he see women as worthy, or Jews as worthy, Jews as worthy of having Second Amendment rights. I mean, think about it from the position of a Native American. You have weapons and you're using them to fight back against tyranny. Does it matter whether it's this guy named George and the guys wearing the red jackets, or this other guy named George and these guys wearing the blue jackets? Tyranny is tyranny is tyranny. But supposedly these guys, upper right here, supposedly enshrined his right to carry a weapon against them. Let's say this again. Supposedly, these guys over here, upper right, George Washington, Founding Fathers, Continental Army, enshrined a right in the Constitution, a right given by God, inalienable, to this guy to take up arms and fight against them. And if you say anything else, well, no, they meant the other white people. Oh, the other white people. The rights were only for the other white people to take. Really? If that's the case, if that's truly the case, let's go back to Andrew Jackson, where he continued that he was terrified. Rather than keep their arms in good condition, Jackson's men had let the guns rust, sold them from cash, and we have the impolicy of relying in time of necessity upon such a distribution of arms. Better, argued Jackson, to store up weapons and arsenals. The only certain dependence is upon well-stored arsenals, judiciously located from whence arms may be withdrawn in time of war. This was about the militia. This was about the militia, what we would call the National Guard. And you can see it in history. You can literally hear the words. And you can see by who wasn't guaranteed these rights that it wasn't for everybody. It wasn't for everybody. And it was only, when was the 18th, when we got to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, did we start talking about citizens of the United States versus people or men. Read, and don't try to read what you want into it. And look at the actions. Let's go back to this. Now, are you sure? Are you sure you are characterizing the Founding Fathers by their actions and not just being fooled by their words? Are you sure? That's a tough one now, isn't it? I'll give you the links. I will give you the links. The first one, I don't think I need to link the preamble to the Constitution. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. I think everybody knows about the Trails of Tears. I probably don't need to link that. Here it is. HistoryNewsNetwork.org. Or you can probably just search why Andrew Jackson believed in gun control. Now, what I'm saying, let me be absolutely clear. I think it's a great idea to have weapons. I would highly recommend anyone who has the ability to get one, who doesn't have one, get one. At least one. But don't delude yourself into thinking you have a right. It's legal, but you don't have a right. You keep reading, shall not be infringed, shall not be infringed. This is talking about the federal government taking away the right of the state to have a National Guard. Because one of the first uses of it was Andrew Jackson using the militia to put down free citizens, free peoples trying to rise up against tyranny. Can you think of any better definition of tyranny than this? Can you think of any better definition of tyranny than what happened to the Native Americans in North America in the 1800s? Sorry about that. I mean, if somebody can explain how this isn't tyranny, I would love to hear it. If somebody can explain how going to a continent and finding people there and throwing them in chains and putting them in boats and then shipping them across the sea and then auctioning those men and women off as property, which Andrew Jackson did, but still believing in inalienable rights of men, if that's not hypocrisy, I don't know what is. The inalienable rights of men shows clearly these guys had a very, very different definition of what men were. And when it comes to women, ladies, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but if you're one of these women that likes to yammer on about the Founding Fathers and your Second Amendment rights, you just don't know history. It's a great idea for women to be armed. It's absolutely a fantastic idea for women to be armed. But don't delude yourself into thinking that you have a constitutional right to it. You don't. Nobody does. That's why it's very important to be armed before they realize, and some judge realizes, yeah, look at the very actions of the Founding Fathers in the years after the Revolutionary War, and you will see clearly they did not believe in the right of the people to bear arms to rise up against them, because literally they took action to disarm them. So I'll leave it there. God bless. Like, share, subscribe. Once again, happy Hanukkah. Merry Christmas. Like, share, subscribe. We'll see you guys next time.